to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we got Coach Preston from Trash Talk Tailgate coming with us as a special guest. Dude, it's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me again, man.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to talk some ball with you. And, just for everybody in the audience here who isn't familiar with your show, can you give us a little bit of background about how that started and exactly what you do?
So the Trash Talk Tailgate is I'm a D1 college football coach. I've coached at a bunch of different schools from D3 all the way up to D1. And I love talking ball. And me and some of my friends decided to make a YouTube show just about football. We talk about the NFL. We talk about college football, just everything. We're doing a bunch of stuff on the draft this year, which I'm really, really excited about. And the one thing that I'm really the most proud of with the TTT is that we are right. Whenever we really say something and we mean it, we're right 95% of the time. Like, we really know ball. I truly believe we know ball better than anyone else. So if you love ball and you love talking ball, we do live streams. Come talk shit to me. I don't care. Like, I want you guys to come be a part of it. Come be a part of the Trash Talk Tailgate. We just love talking ball, and we're right way more often than we're wrong. So come be a part of the TTT.
Yeah, definitely appreciate you sharing that with everybody too. And that's one thing that drew me to your channel especially, is just the authenticity and most importantly, just the passion and the personality too, that kind of all comes together. I'll definitely put your info on X and your YouTube channels and all that good stuff in the
description of the
video. Yeah, of course. So we were talking a little bit off camera too, in terms of the college football season, some of the bigger programs. But I think in this time of the year, you're flirting with spring football right now. You're at the point where your coaching staff for the most part is set. Most of your roster is set. And now it's kind of time that we're looking down, sitting at the schedules, look at the recruiting classes. And I kind of think to myself, like, what are some of the sleeper teams that we should be looking at for 2025? Because now we have 136 teams in FBS football. It's really kind of difficult to navigate all the different programs, be able to show some love for all the teams. In a perfect world, I'd love to talk about all of them, but we only have so much time in the day. So with that said, what's a program or two that you've, caught your eye on that you think could really, take a big step forward for this 2025 season? I know we're a little bit early, but it's still fun to speculate and talk about it.
Well, when you first told me that you wanted to do this, I always know what, the majority of people are going to say. And the two teams that I've been hearing the most, and for good reason, I guess, but I get it, are South Carolina and Florida. Florida because of DJ Lagway and the way they kind of finished the year. South Carolina because of Lenore Sellers beating Clemson, and the way they kind of finished the year. So, South Carolina loses a lot, though, so I don't know if I would really call them a sleeper, but I didn't want to go in that direction. I always like to be one-off, but I still think I really believe that this team can be a sleeper. And it's not in the SEC. It's in the Big 12. And we kind of talked off camera. You couldn't guess what it was, but I'm going to go Texas Tech.
Okay.
Yeah. You disagree?
I don't disagree with necessarily. I know you're going to get into the recruiting class and everything and how much money that they've spent, but I'm definitely fascinated with how you're going to go with it, because Texas Tech, we've talked about this off camera too, outside of the Mike Leach era, they've been kind of always stuck in between, getting a bowl game here and there, but not able to fit that 9-10 win plateau that I think you would want to see out of them.
Yep. So the big reason I'm saying Texas Tech is, first of all, I always look at returning production. That doesn't always accumulate to future success, because, I'm a diehard Virginia Tech fan. They had one of the best returning production rates going into college football last year, and they completely shit the bed. It was awful. It was a bad year, but they have 74% of their returning production. Texas Tech does. 68% on offense, 82% on defense, and they went 8-4 last year. They had a good year, and like you said, for the past few years now, they have two former players, John Sellers and Cody Campbell, who recently sold their oil and mineral company for $2.8 billion. And now that NIL and it's, with the transfer portal and everything, you're just basically able to buy players. They're just funneling that shit, all that money to the Texas Tech football program. So they have been able to get really good recruiting classes the last few years. Most notably their wide receiver, Micah Hudson, they were able to get. And I mean, the one thing that concerns me about Texas Tech, I love their returning production, but I don't love their schedule. Because in 2025, they have to go at Utah, at Arizona State, who just made the playoff last year, and at Kansas State, who, we've talked about before. They're always going to be one of the favorites to win the Big 12. The thing about the Big 12, though, that I don't think enough people talk about, they're all the same team. They all recruit at roughly the same level, anywhere from that 45 to, 60 range. Ever since Texas and Oklahoma left, there's not a juggernaut in terms of recruiting and in terms of resources. So Texas Tech very well could be that. It honestly reminds me a lot of what Oklahoma State had with T. Boone Pickens, with all their, money being funneled toward the football program.
That's a great
comparison. That really helped kind of skyrocket that program. But they're all the same team, basically. That's the beauty of the Big 12 is like, there's not an Alabama or a Texas or an Oklahoma or, a Clemson. They're all the same team. They all recruit the same. They all recruit in that same range. They're all the same team. So I think Texas Tech with their returning production and, and with their recruiting that is on the rise, I think Texas Tech could make a big jump to, go 10-2, maybe even 11-1 in the Big 12 and make a potentially college football playoff appearance.
Yeah, because you definitely made some great points there. And by the way, I am a huge fan of Joey McGuire. I do think what they're building there is legit. I think they're at the point where they're finally building that foundation. They have a legit culture identity where you sit there and fans are starting to say, what's Red Raider football? And people, in Lubbock, Texas are able to kind of have an imagination of what that looks like too. And even when you go back and look at a couple games from last year, I mean, I go back and think about that Oklahoma State game that ended up being a total, just back and forth of just no defense whatsoever. And I guess that's what
that's the Big 12 though.
Yeah, I mean, you do have a handful of teams like that. I mean, you have like the Oklahoma States of the world who didn't play any defense at all last year. I go back and think of West Virginia, and I put Texas Tech similarly in that category, not as worse as them, but they've made some good progress, particularly in the transfer portal front, within the top 5 in terms of that. Spent over $10 million in terms of really rebooting this together and kind of trying to get that quick fix too. But they're in a good spot because, like you said too, they're bringing back 75% of their production. They have the endorsements now, and they finally have a coaching staff there that's definitely pretty well put together too. So I'm glad that you talked about Texas Tech. That's one of those programs where people just kind of have a reaction about them. Like, hey, I go back and I think of the days of Mike Leach where they had the spread offense. Then Cliff Kingsbury had his run there and all that good stuff too. But I'm definitely excited to see how Texas Tech's going to look, particularly on the defense side of the ball, because to me, that's the biggest question mark. Now, do I think they have to play lights out defense like Utah every week? No. But they're definitely going to have to. They're definitely have to be more balanced, like they weren't really last year. And I think that's why they were kind of stuck in that 7-8 win range. When I think in reality that they have the talent to get to that 9-10 win echelon, assuming that you beat Arizona State and Kansas State and Utah, those deep pivotal games that just happen every year when you're in the Big 12.
They're all on the road. I do want to say one thing because you mentioned it. You mentioned they have a top 5 transfer portal class. Don't put any stock into that. For anyone watching, if you're a college football fan, don't put any stock into transfer portal class rankings because it's a fucking crapshoot. Like high school rankings, are a crapshoot, but high school rankings typically, they do have a very high hit rate. With the transfer portal, you don't know what the fuck you're bringing into your program. Because you have at most maybe 3 weeks to really recruit and get to know these kids in the portal. I mean, look at Florida State last year. They don't recruit that well out of high school. They went 13-0 2 years ago. They went 2-10 last year because they brought in a bunch of transfers. And when you bring in a bunch of I call them mercenaries basically, because you're paying them now. And if shit starts to go sideways, they don't have any loyalty to you or the school. They're not going to play as hard. They're not going to try as hard. And I think that's the worry I have, and I think other people should have too with the transfer portal, is don't put any stock into those. Like, the way to success, the way to real sustained success is to recruit high school well, have a good culture, and bring in transfers to supplement holes in your roster. Don't build through the transfer portal. Like, don't have your whole team turned over every year through the portal. So just the top 5, transfer portal class, I don't put a whole lot of stock into that. And I don't think other people should either. But everything else you said is right.
I mean, there's a degree. My only pushback on that is not so much necessarily that you shouldn't care about the rankings. I look at it as more of a marketability sort of thing. If I sit there and say to myself, let's just say I'm a recruit, right? And I'm saying, hey, I got, like, they even picked up David Bailey, the Stanford offensive linebacker, who I think is going to be a really big addition too. But I look at it more from that perspective, not so much like, oh, they're ranked 5th. Like, obviously it numerically it sounds good, but my argument, I guess, more for it is, as a recruit, if I sit there and I say to myself, hey, they have all these donors who are coming in, they just recently renovated their a lot of their, football facilities. And not to mention, when you hear, a $10 million figure, you sit there and say to yourself, hey, they're taking ball a lot more seriously now. And obviously, to your point too, like, hey, I could talk about Kentucky, for example, who is consistently in the top 10 in the transfer portal, and they haven't done jack shit in the past 5 years or so. So exactly. I kind of sit there and I say to myself, well, you do want to believe in the ranking to some degree, because a lot of the times they are kind of replacing those immediate guys that you can kind of plug in right away. You rent them for a season, and then they go off to the NFL or make their NIL money or whatever too. But I would definitely agree with you in the sense that, we've both been watching college ball for such a long time. And at the end of the day, the bread and butter and the reason why the Dabo Sweeneys and the Kirby Smarts of the world have won and Nick Saban's have won multiple national titles, it's because they recruit well, they are disciplined, and the kids are well coached too. And most importantly, the kids actually want to play and be there, regardless of how much money you're making in terms of, your season every year.
The other thing about the transfer portal, I feel like there's so many similarities between the transfer portal and NFL free agency. And I will die on this hill. The transfer portal, like, there's a reason they're transferring. If you're a good player at your current school, like, and they think they can, and you think you can, they think that you can help them win football games now and in the future, they're going to keep you. So if you're in the transfer portal and they just let you walk, there's typically a reason, which more often than not to me is a red flag. So it's kind of like NFL free agency. Like, if you're a really good player, your team's going to keep you. They're going to pay to keep you. So there's a reason you're in the portal. So that's just another red flag that I would have. But again, like you said, your bread and butter for a championship contending, consistent football program is through high school recruiting. It should never be through the transfer portal.
Yeah, because at the same time too, we never know how much. I mean, their agent might spitball a figure that we might think that they're getting paid. You can look on a couple websites and say, hey, this kid's making $500,000, this kid's making $1 million, or whatever too. But a lot of that is behind closed doors at the end of the day. And I'm kind of thinking to myself, like, what it is right now. And to me, it's very similar to the Premier League over in England, where, they have a budget in terms of what they're doing. And it's kind of a crapshoot now, because like, nobody's paying, like in MLB at least, or NBA, you pay like a luxury tax or something like that if you go over a certain amount, where now it's pretty much, half the year the coaches are sitting there and they're having to fundraise for their programs instead of coaching and developing players now. So it's much more exactly what you're saying too, where it's much more of a now kind of thing, and just how coaches, quite frankly, are just way short of a leash than they used to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so who are some of your sleepers? I told you mine, which is Texas Tech. Who do you think some of the sleepers this year are?
Yeah, it's fascinating because you said Texas Tech, and I at first I thought you were going to say Kansas State, and I would have been okay if you said Kansas too, because I think they're another fascinating team, because I think Lance Leopold is one of the best in terms of X's and O's coaches in the country. I think he's somebody that I don't think it gets a lot of love, and I think the reason why people aren't talking about him as much this year is because they don't have Devin. They don't have that 1-2 punch. Like, I mean, obviously they have Daniel still, but they don't have Devin Neal anymore. And I think that's going to be a big missing piece for him. And quite frankly, they're have to rely on Daniels a lot more, particularly as a runner too. But outside of
They
that,
they also lost Andy Kotelnicki, this past year, but they still don't have him. So their offensive, he's a great offensive coordinator.
yeah, I wish, and again, I wish we would have saw that more when they played Ohio State this year. But I digress. But I definitely wanted to give Kansas some love. But I'd say the one team that's on my mind that now it's a funny segue because you mentioned the Big Ten. I'm gonna throw Minnesota out there.
Minnesota.
And I say Minnesota for a couple of different reasons. Now, obviously, I'm not saying they're gonna be anywhere near Oregon or Penn State or Michigan. I'm not sitting there saying that. But what I am going to get at is, if you ask me what's a program that I sit there and ask myself, if I were a head football coach, I would want to replicate a program like that. Minnesota is one of those teams that come to mind for me. I sit there and I see a guy like PJ Fleck, who I think he is a type of guy. He's a player. He's a player's coach. He was a wide receiver in the NFL for a number of years. He's a driven guy. He's passionate. He's enthusiastic. He's excited. And I sit there and I say to myself too, even the past 10 years of Gopher football, for the most part, they've had a winning season almost every season for the past decade or so. So in terms of like the pillar of consistency that they have, and on top of that, they're returning a good amount of talent from last year. I mean, I sit there and I say to myself, they upgraded at quarterback. Their defense is always pretty sound, particularly within the linebacking core and that front seven. And not to mention too, I sit there and look at their schedule this year, and I say to myself, I think realistically you can probably start off 4-1, 5-1, because I go down the line. You play Buffalo, you play Northwestern State, you have to travel to UCal, unfortunately, but I would say that's a game that they should be winning. Then you go next week and play Rutgers. Then you're on the road versus Ohio State, and then you go back to Purdue. So I'm sitting there saying, okay, even I'm not going to go through the rest of the schedule, but if I sit there and say,
it's tough. The rest of the schedule is kind of tough.
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State, obviously, I'm not going to sit here and call that they're going to beat Ohio State in April. But what I will say is they have pretty much every reason in the world to believe that they should, at the very least, be 5-1 going into their October 18th game versus Nebraska too, who they'll be home against too. And Minnesota is a really tough place to play too. So I think there's a couple of reasons to be excited about them. And I know there's going to be some question marks about them not having Corey Heatherman, who went to Miami. I mean, they've had pretty much top 10, top 15 defenses for a while now, and I think that is going to be one of those questions with them too. But I'm going to show them some love.
I mean, they played. I mean, they almost beat Penn State last year. They almost beat Michigan. Michigan wasn't that great, but they did beat Ohio State. They got blown up by Iowa. They almost beat USC, and I'm not that high on USC or Lincoln Riley, but still, that's something, And then they crushed Wisconsin at the end of the year. So honestly, I don't hate that. I think that's honestly a really good pick. The only pushback I would have is they're not in the Big Ten West anymore. Since the Big Ten went away from divisions, the Big Ten East was always a lot more difficult because you had Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State all in one division. But, and now with the addition of Oregon and USC and Washington, their schedule in general is going to be a lot harder. And I know they went 8-5 last year, but that back half of the schedule was kind of tough, because you have to go at Oregon, you play Wisconsin. That's their rivalry game every year. They could beat Nebraska. They could also lose to Nebraska. I don't know. I definitely think that is a solid sleeper, though. I like that pick.
Yeah, because I think it's one of those things, too, where I almost put Arkansas in the same sort of category, which is another honorable mention, I would say. But they're both those programs, what they both have in common is, hey, they don't have a problem with getting recruits there. You can sell the program enough based off, hey, the history of the program, the fact that you're in a top conference, the fact that you're going to be playing, a lot of these top teams every year, like you said, too. If you're a Minnesota fan, they're going to be traveling to Iowa, they're going to be traveling to Michigan State, they're going to be traveling to Ohio State, they're going to be going to Camp Randall, all those things that, as much as it's difficult, that's also part of being able to sell the program as well, too. Yeah. So it's kind of that one-two punch that, yes, people bitch, for example, that the first couple games of every power school is against a bunch of nobodies. But at the same time, too, you get those conference games at the end of the year that, yes, there's a couple of them that they always play every year, but you do get surprised every once in a while with a couple of new ones.
Yeah. I like Minnesota. Like I said, I think PJ Fleck's a really good coach. I think he's proven that. They had that 11-win season a few years ago, back in 2019, I think.
Yeah.
And they've just kind of been kind of up and down. They had injuries. Darius Taylor last year was hurt at the beginning of the year. I like Minnesota, though. I like that pick. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess one other honorable mention I'll give to, outside of, I can go into Arkansas, but I'm not going to, because I think I'd piss a lot of Arkansas fans off if I said that. But I'm going to throw Georgia Tech out there, too. I think that definitely
I like that.
Enough love, too, considering how many top 25 opponents that they beat. I know that Zach Pylon is transferred and everything, too. Their offense is going to look a little bit different compared to last year. But I think Brent Key is really, going to turn that program in the right direction, too. And especially with how the ACC looks right now, if they really want to make a statement outside of just kind of the beginning of the year, I think this is the time to do it. And hope.
Brent Key is a hell of a coach. I love how he runs his football program. I think the entire country saw what kind of coach Brent Key was. In that Thanksgiving game against Georgia last year, where I don't remember how many overtimes it went to, but
like 7 or 8. But
they came so close to beating Georgia, and it's just I really love what Brent Key is building. They're in Atlanta, which is a great recruiting footprint. Obviously, Georgia is going to dominate the state of Georgia. But if you can just get a few key guys from Atlanta and from the surrounding counties, you can have a really good football program really quickly. And that's what Brent Key has done. Georgia Tech, I really like that Georgia Tech pick, because I love Brent Key. He's one of my favorite coaches in all of college football. I love Brent Key. He runs the football and he plays really great defense. That's still – you dominating the trenches, that's how you win football games. That's never going to change. That's why Oregon with Chip Kelly, they never won a national championship. All these finesse teams are not going to win. You have to be able to, at the end of the day, assert your dominance and run the ball and stop the run. Football starts and ends in the trenches. That's never going to change. And Brent Key understands that better than most coaches in the country, I think. And that's awesome. Because I thought about Georgia Tech, but it's just you still have to deal with Clemson. You still have to deal with a more talented Florida State. I don't know what Florida State's going to be this year. NC State's always up there.
North Carolina
Miami.
too. What's going to happen with
Yeah,
Bill
North
Belichick year
Carolina
one?
with Bill Belichick. I don't know what to expect out of the ACC this year. That's why I couldn't put Georgia Tech in there. Like, I feel like the Big 12, everyone's the same team. You know what I mean? So that's why I went Texas Tech with my sleeper. But I do love Georgia Tech. That's a great pick.
Yeah, because I guess the conversation depends too. Like, are you good? The thing about the Big 12 is, like, yes, they're all kind of similar in terms of where they're recruiting, what the schedules look like, and all that stuff. I think what the big difference is like what their cultures are, what their identities are. Because especially now with Colorado now being in the Big 12, like, to me, that's one team that I think definitely adds kind of like a different flavor too. Because a lot of these teams are in the Mountain West, the Midwest, and there's a certain kind of culture there. So for Dion to kind of come over and bring that different flavor, a different vibe to it, I definitely think it not only just makes it better for college football in general, but just good for the sport as a whole too. Because I think it's the one thing that's kind of really unfortunate about the Pac-12 not being there anymore is not only the geographical element of it too, but just the fact that all Power Five conferences, they were all sort of even in that sense. You know what I mean? Because there's like the top tier, the middle tier, and then just the whatever tier.